When we talk about 40k and the meta, it's a term that gets thrown around a lot. Hello and welcome to Epic Flail 40k Tactics. My name's Luke, and this week I will be mostly talking about stats, or more specifically, thinking about how these numbers are tracked, what do they really mean, and understanding why these kind of questions matter if we want to stay on top of the meta, or at the very least, understand it. Let's get started. So there are three what I would consider the big sources of stats, and these are StatCheck, Warhammer, and MetaMonday. These three websites, all linked in the description below, collect stats on Warhammer. Each of them do a really great job of telling the story behind the data, which is a really understated aspect of this, which is that they don't just present the information, they provide some commentary and some context and some thoughts around the numbers as well, which is really helpful to unpick them. Ultimately, what's the goal of stat collection in 40k? So this is an attempt to create a snapshot of how the game is being played across the competitive scene. It's useful to have a way to quantify performance, which armies are winning the most games, which factions are struggling, and what specific builds or strategies seem to be dominating. We will rely on a few primary sources for these competitive stats, BCP essentially. We have the data directly from the tournament software, such as Best Coast Pairings, tracking the wins, losses, and occasionally other details about player performance. The advantage here is the scale. BCP is widely used, and so it has a massive data set, but that's not without problems. For example, it includes events of all sizes, from small RTTs to GTs, majors. This means there's a lot of noise in the data. For example, a small 12-player RTT has 3 Eldar armies, all finishing in the top 3. That could make the faction seem disproportionately strong if it's not accounted for correctly. And that is why you see filters by event size. For example, MetaMonday filters out events with fewer than 20 players to get what they consider a more representative sample. But there is a trade-off here as well. When you cut the smaller events, you could be ignoring some valuable data. Small events might show emerging trends or offer insight into what a rogue strategy could be, or newer players or different regions are experimenting with. So whilst filtering like that does help to refine the quantitative aspects of the data, it does mean there is that risk we miss out on certain things if we're not looking at these smaller events. One thing that I find interesting is the mirror matches. How do we resolve 2 players with the same faction? How does that work with understanding a faction's win rate? A mirror match will always end with a win for one side and a loss for the other, so it's difficult to assess a faction's true performance. If we keep mirror matches in the data, they inevitably push a faction's win rate closer to 50%, because every match ends in a 50-50 outcome. You'll see either a shrinking or an increasing, a pull towards the middle ground of a faction's overall win rate compared to if we don't include mirror matches. But then if those numbers are excluded, that presents its own set of problems. For example, excluding mirror matches could then have the adverse effect. It could massively inflate a faction's win rate if the faction is particularly strong. For example, if a faction has a 60% win rate overall, but it's also so popular that mirror matches are rife. If we take those mirror matches out of the equation, it might just push the faction's win rate even higher, but also make it less reflective of the actual experience at tournaments. So some people like to leave them in, because then it provides what they would consider a true win rate, while others remove them, arguing that that is the true win rate, depending on what aspect of the data you want to focus on. And that's not the only factor to consider. Timing and frequency of the data updates can play a role too. MetaMonday is a weekly update, and so they will often caveat if changes have happened and occurred, which is really useful, referencing what I was talking about earlier with commentary, providing the context as to what's actually gone on. Sometimes numbers might seem strange if people have got tournaments in under old rules, for example, affecting how a new landscape might look. So sometimes data can take a little bit of time to iron out or adjust to changes, and you can see things that might occur as a knee-jerk reaction but then level out over time. For example, if one faction gets a series of buffs, they might have a really nice win rate out of the gate. While people are adjusting to the changes, people are jumping on the bandwagon, excited that their faction's got a new lease of life. But then the following weeks, things might then stabilize out as people understand what they're up against, the meta adjusts accordingly, and so the win rate comes down. Or, same scenario, it takes a bit longer for players to crack a faction. It takes a bit of time and practice to realize those benefits, and the win rate instead actually just creeps up ever so slowly over time. If you're enjoying this video, then check out Epic Flail HQ. I occasionally post members-only videos there, and for $2.99 a month, you can get access to those, as well as a whole host of other content that we put on the channel. And not only that, we're streaming UKTC events as well. So check out Epic Flail HQ and get on the Discord. Speaking of win rate, what is considered a true win rate, and how should it be interpreted? Some, for example, argue that a faction's win rate should include the mirror matches because they are part of the game, and others say that removing them gives them that more accurate picture. That's the crux here. And the last point is often what players really care about, but in truth, both do have merit. And as much as it sounds like I'm sitting on the fence here to not offend people, I can see the value in both. And ultimately, it comes down to which one is more correct, depending on what you're trying to achieve. And that's the fun with statistics. You can prove anything with statistics. And so often the outcome or the goal that you're trying to achieve can sometimes colour our view or guide the way in which we look at stats like this. If we're trying to understand what faction might just have the best chance of winning an event, you might want to exclude mirror matches. But if you're trying to get a sense of a faction's overall strength or popularity, including them could be fine. This idea of finding a true win rate is less about finding a single correct answer and more about understanding the context of each number. We need to be aware of how each stat is generated so we can interpret it. It's not just reading a number on a screen and thinking that is the be all and end all. It's actually on us as consumers of this information to understand it and what it actually means. And if a stat is including mirror matches or is not including mirror matches, it's fine as long as you understand that it is or isn't, because then we can look at that number through a more informed lens. Another key metric is the play rate and how often a faction is chosen by players. I'll often say Space Marines is a big one. There's a very popular faction. This is a really important contextual piece of information because it shows us how the player base perceives a faction's power level as well. And a high play rate can indicate that players see the faction as strong or easy to use, whilst a low play rate might indicate a faction is difficult to master or simply underpowered. It's not as simple as that though. Space Marines are eternally popular, and so even if they're not doing particularly well, they still see relatively decent numbers across the board. Same with things like Astra Militarum as well. There are lots of players that just really love the faction, but it's not the only thing that tells us. Play rate and win rate can sometimes tell very different stories. A faction with a high play rate and a moderate win rate might be widely considered as strong, but could have quite a high learning curve, or it means that more casual players are picking it up, which can bring the win rate down. And conversely, a faction with a low play rate but a high win rate could be a hidden gem. A faction with high potential that only a small number of competitive players are capitalizing on. A G-Sealer Cults is an interesting example of another thing happening where you had a very low win rate, very low player rate, but there were a couple of spikes, a couple of individuals doing well in competitive events, had a balance update, and then now the win rate has exploded. And that will be interesting to see how that stabilizes over time as more people begin to learn what GSC can do and understand it, and the meta adapts. As again, another contextual piece around GSC is people don't seem to know an awful lot about GSC and what they do. So that spotlight on GSC is there and people understand it a bit more. Maybe that win rate will naturally start to come down as people are no longer being surprised by it, which is a great example of a strong win rate for GSC at this moment in time not being the be-all and end-all. That's not the whole story. As time goes by, I fully expect that to fluctuate and change. So again, that context is very important. Ultimately, the discrepancy between popularity and performance is an important layer in understanding the meta. When we're looking at win rates, it's valuable to also look at these play rates. Extra bit of context. Are factions under or overperforming relative to their popularity? An interesting discussion point that I've seen is that a lot of this stat collection is not just to scratch that competitive itch and to try and get ahead and the fun and the upkeep of playing competitively and understanding what's going on, but it's actually to give feedback to game designers. Ideally, GW wants a balanced game. We talk about the Goldilocks win rate, this idea of a good win percentage rate, somewhere around 50% win rate. I forget what the amount is. If you know it, put it in the comments, but the Goldilocks win rate, a good win rate really shouldn't be too far above or below that win percentage to create a nice, fair, balancing game for all levels of play. And that is a challenge, right? How do we balance a faction that performs well in the hands of highly skilled players but struggles with newer or more casual players? And this is where things like win rate filters and segmentation by player skill come in play. For instance, isolating the top tier tournaments to see what factions are consistently performing well amongst best players. If you felt inclined, you could have a look at top cut win rate percentages versus Swiss. That might be an interesting comparison point. But even then, it's tough to hit some sort of sweet spot, as balance tweaks that help the average player could make high stakes games skew the other way. If we're 4-0 into a big tournament, then the types of armies and factions we're going to be playing against is going to be very different than if we're X4, for example, against the types of factions and armies we're going to be playing against. That sort of winning meta versus the losing meta in a tournament. You would expect to see different ends of the spectrum, and that will often be the case in the top cuts and the finals of these games, which is why I think it would be an interesting thing to compare win rates of factions in those games versus the Swiss. Win rates are a fine starting point, but they don't capture the skill required to play a faction or the complexity of these matchups across the game's factions or across brackets at a tournament. And this is where the in-depth player feedback and meta-analysis comes into play if we're looking at trying to use these results to understand game balance. And to that end, another layer that pure statistics can struggle to capture is the skill ceiling and skill floor of different factions. High skill ceiling meaning there's lots of potential to do well if you know the faction inside and out and no mistakes. A high skill floor, on the other hand, means that even a beginner can pick up the faction and do reasonably well. Gene stealer cults, not to keep talking about gene stealer cults, is often the go-to example of experienced players can pull off impressive maneuvers and win games with finesse, but the skill floor is low, meaning it is incredibly unforgiving and difficult to pick up. So this can mean that the win rates fluctuate significantly based on the skill of the player pool, and that is a factor that raw numbers struggle to reflect. So when we look at data, it's useful to keep these distinctions in mind and think about that when we're looking at a win rate. GSC, for example, having a decent win rate at the moment might be strong. It might also be difficult to pilot. And so jumping onto that faction thinking you are going to enjoy a solid win rate if you've never played the faction before, it's not necessarily going to play out how you think. Talking about Space Marines earlier being a popular faction, and this is another issue. Space Marines do have lots of data available simply because more players choose them. And this does make it easier to get a more reliable win rate for a faction as a whole. But less popular factions, the sample size is quite small. And that does mean you see more volatile spikes in the data, which is again, why I say what I said earlier about GSC. I want to see how things play out over time. It'd be interesting to see quite how that win percentage changes, and my gut is telling me that it's going to come down a bit. Ultimately, small sample sizes can lead to overestimations or underestimations of a faction's strength. In any given tournament, a small faction might perform very well or very poorly due to the small number of games. If we happen to catch that faction on a good weekend, its win rate might spike, as we're seeing with GSC. It's doing particularly well at the moment. This could be misleading if it turns out the faction actually isn't that strong in the meta overall as things correct and things change. This could be an example of an overestimation. Not denying the faction is very strong and very good, but this is still a small sample size in the context of the whole of 10th. And this is why it's important with any data and interpreting the stats, it's acknowledging when there's enough data to draw a meaningful conclusion. For less popular factions, a few good or bad games shouldn't be taken as a definitive proof of strength or weakness, but rather as potential indicators, things to watch for trends over time. And this is why other metrics can be useful. So obviously win rates and play rates, these are the common ones, but there are other stats that provide insights. One I really like is the overrep or over-representation metric that StatCheck utilizes. It's just the metric that shows whether a faction appears in the top rankings of a tournament more often than you would expect based on its play rate, its over-representation rate. For example, if a faction makes up 10% of the player base, but occupies 30% of the top tables, that's a sign that it's overperforming. Similarly, if event wins and top 4 finishes give a sense of which factions are consistently doing well at the highest levels, these metrics allow us to get a better view of which factions are succeeding across different regions and events. But each of those, again, has its own limitations. Top table representation and event wins are useful for tracking high-performing factions, but aren't always representative of broader gameplay trends, and a faction can be underrepresented at the top levels and still have a high win rate at local tournaments, and vice versa. And this is why this context and comprehensive approach to the data often requires looking at multiple different things, and not just thinking win rate's high, that's the big bad at the moment. It's not as simple as that. By looking at a variety of data points, we can have a look at a fuller picture, see how each faction is performing. So with all this talk of data and sample sizes and blah, 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 let's bring it back to the most important question, which is what does it actually mean for me as a player? And understanding the mechanics of stat collection can help you make smarter choices about which factions to play, which lists to build, and how to approach the meta. But when we're looking at the stats, it's important to keep in mind that no single number tells the full story, but it's only part of the picture. When you see a faction with a high win rate, ask yourself why. Is this because the faction is inherently powerful, or is it simply popular right now? Maybe it's a combination of both of those things. When a faction has a low play rate but still performs well, consider whether that faction might be harder to play and more rewarding for skilled players. It might mean you have to actually respect it a little bit more when you come up against it, because you can't always account for the opponent sitting opposite you as well. At the end of the day, numbers give us a direction, but they don't replace experience. If a faction appeals to us, we shouldn't be put off by the win rates alone, and if we're chasing the meta, remember that the numbers alone won't make us a better player. Stats are there to inform, but it's ultimately about what we do on the tabletop that matters. It's complex, as we've seen, but the next time you see a stat thrown around, hopefully you'll have a better understanding of the work that goes into generating it and the thought that goes into presenting it in the way that it has been presented. They're tools, not gospel. The joy of 40k lies not just in the numbers, but in the experience of playing, learning, and growing as a player. But that's all from me for now. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching. Keep rolling those dice and stay tuned for more.